This is Brother Merrill's Inspirational Stories. I have a great story this week. I hope you enjoyed as much as I have. It should be a movie. It's a great story. Most people know that the true settler of the western United States, especially the Intermountain West, was Brigham Young. He brought the saints to Utah, and then he began to send families and settlers out to outlying areas. He settled over 100 towns, the western slope of Colorado, from San Diego to Alberta, Canada, to Juarez, Mexico. And today's story takes place in Juarez, and it is quite an amazing story. As the tension between the federal government and the Mormons, as they were called in those days, mounted, the Edmunds Act was passed in 1882, which banned polygamy even in the United States. There was a fraction as many people from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints practicing polygamy at the time as there were throughout the rest of the country. But the tension had mounted, and the LDS Church and its property became the target. The Spanish-American War had ended, and the western United States had become part of the United States. When the saints got here, it was not. It was part of Mexico. And with that came the federal government. Some of the saints were practicing polygamy. It was not as widespread. I believe about 3% of the church at the time was involved with it. But those men became outlaws, and many of them moved to Juarez, Mexico. So the population of Juarez grew substantially with the influx of polygamists who were trying to get away from the United States government. During that time, there was a revolution taking place in Mexico. There were several different factions that were trying to rise to power. The most powerful army in Mexico by far belonged to Pancho Villa. He was more of a warrior and a general and a tactician than he was a politician. And so in the early 1900s, around 1912, the United States government recognized President Carranza as the president of Mexico. And through some double dealing and backroom situations, Pancho Villa suddenly found himself an outlaw. He had this huge army, over 12,000 men at the time, and suddenly he had no finances to pay them. And they were the highest paid army and the best trained in Mexico. A few thousand of his men moved to the Sierra Madres and hid in the mountains of the Sonora and the Chihuahua states of northern Mexico. But so you had this guy, Pancho Villa, that was much like Shiz in the book of Ether, where everyone was scared to death because his men, the way they were being paid, was they'd just go in and pillage a town. They would rape, plunder, and burn everything and leave all the residents hanging in trees dead. And especially if you were from the United States, because he felt like the United States government had betrayed him. In 1912, all of these people that had come from the United States fled. In fact, they loaded their families and their belongings on boxcars, and the men drove what livestock they could to El Paso, Texas, and they went over the border to try to get away from the reach of Pancho Villa, because his men were like Gadianton robbers. They were going through and just terrorizing all of northern Mexico. At that point, Pancho Villa's men had free reign over the northern part of the country. They destroyed the railroad systems. They controlled the roadways. They took all livestock, horses, cattle, anything that was alive, they took with them. And they left these little towns just desolate. But a few of the brave individuals that had fled to El Paso decided they were going back home. And so about 300 men, women, and children came back to Colonia Juarez. And the stake president there, President Bentley, realized the tentative situation he was in and their people, and so he appointed several men to be scouts to keep an eye on Pancho Villa and his men. Pancho Villa, meantime, was struggling to pay his people because he had a couple of thousand loyal men, but he had to feed them, he had to supply them with ammunition and weapons and the energy to stay. And so he planned a raid on Columbus, New Mexico. He sent some scouts, and they came back and falsely reported to him that there was plenty to plunder, but hardly anyone to protect the fort. And so he planned a raid. The scouts from President Bentley came and told him that the armies of Pancho Villa were marching very near to Juarez, and they were all very worried. But he marched past to the north into New Mexico. Columbus is 3 miles over the border, and he surprised them. His pattern was he would attack before dawn in the dark and just come into a town and just wipe it out. While everybody was in bed, he would surprise them, burn down the houses, kill all the residents. He didn't realize that the 13th Cavalry was there. And several of the men sprang into action. In their bare feet and bare-chested, they were able to man 4 of the old-fashioned machine guns. And they were able to set up 4 machine gun positions. The men of Pancho Villa were illuminated by the fires that they had set. And in 90 minutes, the battle was over. The 4 machine guns had fired over 20,000 rounds, killing many of the men and wounding many others. Pancho Villa was on a hillside. He sounded the retreat, and they fled back into Mexico. They were injured. They were missing many of their men. They still had almost 2,000 mounted soldiers, and they put the wounded on the horses, and many men were walking. In order to rally the troops, Pancho Villa told them, the Mormons have come back to Juarez, and they've got a lot of stuff there. You can go into Juarez. There's no holds barred. You can do whatever you want. Rape, pillage, plunder. The only requirement is that you leave nothing alive and not a building unburned. At 2 a.m, President Bentley's scouts returned to his home. The people were living in complete terror and fear because they knew that Pancho Villa was on the warpath and he was in their neighborhood. President Bentley was out trying to calm people down and comfort people and counsel people. When the scouts came to his home, he found 4 teenage boys there. And that's who gives this account of what happened. The scouts told them that Pancho Villa's men were at the edge of their town, and that before dawn they would come in, and they planned to kill everyone in the town and burn it to the ground. And complete terror and bedlam took over the town. Mothers were getting their children and their babies out of bed and hiding them in trees and in bushes, burying them in the sand and putting branches over their faces so that they could hide from the troops. And everyone expected, this will be my last day on earth. These 4 teenage boys could hardly sleep because of the anticipation of what was awaiting them in just a matter of hours. They waited. They waited. Young man says the dawn came peacefully. Birds were singing. The sun rose. It began to get warm. And no sign of Pancho Villa or his men. They didn't know what had happened. The scouts followed Pancho Villa's men for quite a while, and some of the scouts came back and reported to President Bentley. Just after dawn, all the troops were moving away from Colonia Juarez. We don't know what happened. The little Mormon community was spared. No one was killed. Years later, President Bentley was traveling. He was with the mission president at the time, President Wetton. To put it in context, the mission president and the stake president, they were camped by a spring, not staying at anyone's home or in a hotel, and a bunch of Pancho Villa's men came. It was years later, but Pancho Villa was still terrorizing the communities, and they took both of these men to the camp of Pancho Villa. And when they got there, one of the most brilliant generals in that part of Mexican history was General Angeles. And he had requested to visit with these two leaders of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in northern Mexico. And for 9 days they were held in the camp. They treated them well, they fed them well, and they were generally given great hospitality. They were able to converse freely with Pancho Villa and with General Angeles. And during their visit, President Bentley said, "Pancho Villa, why didn't you attack Colonia Juarez as you had planned? My scouts told me that you were sitting on the edge of our town waiting. What happened?" Let me read you what Pancho Villa said. This comes from a great little book from Preston Nibley, where I got this story. "Mr. Bentley," he said, "this is one thing I have never been able to understand myself. It might interest you to know that when we got to the edge of those colonies, a great vision opened up before me. And instead of seeing those colonies as I remember them, I could see all the houses all right, but they were all in flames. I can see that picture now. Those homes were burning. And I felt that the heat would be so terrific that it would be unsafe for me and my army with our wounded men to venture anywhere near it. The surprising thing was that none of my men saw the same picture that I saw, and when I gave them the command to turn aside and march around the colonies, taking our wounded soldiers with us, many of them were very resentful and reminded me of my promise. He had promised them that they could plunder the town. But I turned to them and said, 'Can't you see the colonies are on fire? It would be dangerous to go in.' But they couldn't see it. Because they couldn't, it angered me, and I gave the command that any man who didn't obey my order should be shot. We marched around the town, and it wasn't until we had gone miles that I came to realize that perhaps I had been mistaken, and maybe those colonies weren't on fire. I turned around and looked toward them, but I could see nothing. Yet I felt we were too far away to turn back then, so we continued on. No, Mr. Bentley, I have never been able to understand it to this day, because I have learned since that those colonies were not on fire, that not a single house was burned, and yet I saw that picture as vividly as I see you standing in front of me." We all have things happen to us in our lives that try us and test us. Sometimes our prayers aren't answered quite the way we want. Sometimes the hand of the Lord miraculously changes events, as he did this day in northern Mexico. The Lord loves you, and I promise, as you listen to the feelings of your heart, you can know the truth of all things. If you doubt the Lord loves you, think about it, and then go somewhere alone and kneel down and verbally ask the Lord, "Do you love me?" I promise you, if you will do that, you will feel his love pour into your heart and your mind. This has been Brother Merrill's Inspirational Stories. I hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you. Watch every Saturday morning. I'll post more.